messing with you. Yeah, well, that's kind of my description here. But I'm like 200 something, all right? But I'm not, obese. You guys know I cycle, try to stay in shape. I could probably lose 10, 15 pounds, but who can't? I'm working on it, okay? Less carbs, I know. And not drinking, right? Between the two. But anyway, seats are cramped. No matter if you're just average. But if you're above average, you're a bigger guy, and maybe you are 75 pounds overweight, maybe 100 pounds overweight, some maybe 200-300 pounds overweight. Now, what happens? Now, I've worked with people that have been overweight, and I haven't thought any less of them. You realize that they were overweight. They may have huffed and puffed a little bit more. It was a little bit tougher, more difficult. And in some instances from that, I've had friends. Chuck Harder, the founder of the program, was very big, very obese. Very talented, great guy. Didn't think any less of him, but I saw that there were challenges. And one of the biggest challenges when you're flying is that just because you're bigger, your fat rolls might roll into somebody else's seat. Now, I know that's embarrassing, and I know some of you are like, well, that's wrong, but there was a man this is a true story, and an Australian man is currently suing American Airlines, and what he's alleging is that he suffered serious injuries, okay, after being seated next to two passengers he claims were grossly obese. Michael Anthony Taylor of Wollongong, New South Wales, was flying from Sydney, Australia to L.A. in December of 2015, a 14-hour journey. It's a long trip. Now, Taylor was seated in the window seat of the economy class, and according to court documents, there were two overweight passengers, and they were seated in his row. Now, according to the lawsuit, the body of the passenger next to Taylor spilled over and encroached upon his seat, forcing him to contort his body into a series of positions, including standing up, crouching, kneeling, and leaning forward. And that's according to these court documents. Though it's been well over a year since this trip, Taylor, who suffered from a pre-existing spinal curvature, claims that he suffered even more severe back injuries and neck pain, arguing that the uncomfortable plane ride exacerbated his condition. Now, his lawyer, Taylor's lawyer, Thomas Jensen of Shine Lawyers, said his client asked the cabin crew if he could change his seat, but was denied the reaccommodation request multiple times. Mr. Taylor asked the cabin crew on numerous occasions if he could sit in another passenger seat or sit in one of the crew's seats or sit in the aisle or even to sit in the toilet seat to alleviate the pain and discomfort that he was suffering from. And they didn't do anything. Now, they say the attendants were not able to reseat him since U.S. federal regulations do not allow passengers to sit in crew member jump seats. All 310 seats aboard the 777 were occupied by other passengers on Taylor's December 28th flight. So he's seeking $100,000, not a lot of money, in damages. About $74,000, Jensen added that if his client is victorious, it could be a wake-up call. I guess he's got to split the money a little bit. But it could be a wake-up call, again, for airlines to consider how they're designed and how they're seating and how they seat passengers. Very interesting to think about. I do traveling, and I'm challenged at 6'2", okay? The worst thing is when people recline their seat and crush your knees. I've had it happen where I'm like, I'm sorry, you're killing my knees. I've audibly had to say this to somebody, and I've had them forget and come down again. And, you need to bring up your seat. You're crushing my knees. Please. I mean, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. Now, unless you pay $500 or $800 or more to bump you to, first class seats accommodation where you actually have more room to move around. But, unless somebody else wants to flip that bill for me, I'm not going to pay out that money. But I think there's something to be considered for those that, are overweight. And this is an issue. Again, I don't think it's an issue that people that might find themselves in that overweight position really want to articulate too much because they're already embarrassed about. But there was a guy that was suing McDonald's at one point. It was in a book that was titled back in the 90s, A Nation of Victims, where he was suing McDonald's because their seats were too small, but he was too big. It's one of these issues where I think, that they're going to have to accommodate. There's a lot of people that are overweight. They can't fit. If I'm not obese, I'm not even close to being obese. My doctor might think 15 pounds is. It's ridiculous what they want your ideal weight to be. I'm like, don't you understand? I have wider shoulders. I'm bigger bone. They don't buy it. They think you should be one something. I'm like, come on. It's not going to happen. But anyway, it's frustrating. But these are more airline stories. We got American, we got Delta. I mean, it's just, but the cell phones always capture it. And I tell you, you got to be careful what you say to passengers because now that flight attendant's probably going to lose her job. It was inaccurate information that she gave. And again, you have rights as a passenger. It's called the Passenger Bill of Rights. Okay, you have plenty of rights. You do, but there is the fine print that they can bump you. But what they say was inaccurate, how they went about doing it, and again, drag it off that Oriental gentleman, where he broke his nose, got a concussion, his tooth was knocked out. I mean, it's just, he didn't deserve handling of that kind. It was ridiculous. Even if he ran back on the plane. I might sound like a liberal there, but nobody deserves to be treated like that at all. It's just not a cool thing. Just be careful when you travel. Think smart. And to me, try to, get a window seat if all possible. It's instead of an aisle seat, because there's nothing worse if you're overweight where you actually have to keep up and then blocking the aisles. Just get a window seat. Is probably the best thing. I remember when Chuck flied and when he flew, he had to go to first class. I mean, there was just, you could not get him next to another passenger. It couldn't happen. He couldn't sit in that seat. And a lot of his travels were done through an RV. When we went to Vegas, they were fun trips too, to Vegas, but he got himself a recreational vehicle. And we drove all the way to Las Vegas for the NAB convention in a recreational vehicle back in the 90s. It was cool, but he was comfortable. He had everything he needed. And, Chuck was, great with what he did, ran his mouth and all that other stuff. But he was a big guy. And I've worked with a lot of people that are overweight and, for whatever reason, medically or emotionally or whatever it is, Chuck was just always more or less a big guy and wrestled with weight his whole life and got himself in some trouble with his legs caving out from under him and caused a lot of damage, unfortunately. I mean, if you can lose the weight, I tell people, any way you can possibly do it, try to do it and try to get it done because ultimately life is so much easier and just to get around, just to move around. And I've seen some of the obstacles that people face and it's not easy. So if you're overweight, I am certainly not making fun of you at all by any means. And, we don't know what people go through and why they get to where they're at. And I have not met anybody that has said, I love to be overweight. Like, I just dig it. It's so cool. Nobody likes it. So there's no judgment here whatsoever. By the way, there's a measles an outbreak, and a lot of people are rather uptight about it. Health officials in Minnesota are telling us that they're zeroing in on the state's Somalia American. That's right, there's Somalia American community as they're basically scrambling to contain the largest measles outbreak in the area. They haven't seen it since the 1980s. It's been a while. Oh, and they had an incident in the 1990s too. And there, 460 people contracted the virus and 3 died. As of Thursday, the overall state count reached 41. So 41 had spread outside the group's community. They are in Minnesota. And it's Hennepin County. to include the first adult patient. So the current outbreak has been largely contracted in the county, but a child who contracted the virus traveled to other parts of the state, according to a Minnesota Health Department official. He was telling the Star Tribune officials are also considering, and this is probably a good idea, pretty much instituting a mandatory isolation and quarantine orders for the infected patients and those who may be at high exposure. So that's not a good thing. Symptoms of the highly contagious virus can include fever, cough, runny nose, red eyes, rash. If left unattended, measles can lead to life-threatening conditions such as pneumonia or swelling of the brain. The Somalia outbreak in Minnesota. Scary stuff, folks. Scary stuff. You gotta watch your kids too, man. I tell you, that's the scariest thing. You send them off to school, and the immunizations, they're good for you, they're bad for you. Darned if you do, darned if you don't. But you don't want that. You don't want it. Butler University. Remember we talked about that? Indiana's Butler University. Well, they've decided, we'll see if this works, to tone down the rhetoric surrounding the anti-Donald Trump course being offered to students this fall. Well, students now have the option to sign up for a special topics class titled Trumpism and U.S. Democracy. As an initial course description, charged the president with pretty much reigning over sexism, white supremacy, xenophobia, nationalism, NATOism, and so on and so forth. So the course explores why and how it has happened, how Trump's rhetoric is contrary to the foundation of the U.S. democracy, and with his win means for the future, blah, blah, blah. The course will provide context and depth and student citizens as we look to historical and current texts by renowned authors as well as read experts, okay, on Trump's own The Art of the Deal. And the response to the course from conservatives on campus has been one of concern. So, when I first found out that they initially used the terms strategy or resistance, I didn't know initially what we were trying to mean by that. Jacob Lenarski, the president of Butler University's College of Republicans, told Fox and Friends on Friday, what I do know is just days after the election, Butler President James Danko had sent out a student-wide email, and in that, he had made a point to say that we should all accept President Trump as a winner of the election and move forward after the months of negative political discourse. And I do feel like, the initial term that they had used didn't just line up with President Danko's goals, he said. But Butler isn't alone in offering anti-Trump classes. A resistance school recently ran at Harvard University that 4 seasons tutorial ran from April 5th to the 27th. Students at Butler University pay around $36,000 in tuition. Toning it down a little bit for the anti-Trump course description, but still offering the particular thing, saying that it's bad for democracy. Isn't it the whole point that the people's voice is heard? Isn't the rhetoric of Barack Obama or H.W. Bush or even, say, Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or Richard Nixon, didn't they all have it? Did they all tote the line? Did they all do what they said? Listen to the whole list of promises that were offered during Barack Hussein Obama when he promised the whole world what he was going to do. He would have had you made believe, it was Al Gore, that we're all going to be riding bikes, but that we would all be driving motorized vehicles, that all of our houses would have solar panels on them, and that we would not be using the grid or gasoline. I mean, he had you believe all of these particular things, and he had 8 years to actually make it happen. And everything that he said he was going to, it imploded. But one thing that he did do was he did not bring the races together. he antagonized people, and a lot of